Good morning, Mr. Maxwell and Ms. Gavas, and welcome to this evidence session, and we are extremely grateful for your time here today. We have in the past enjoyed the evidence sessions that we've undertaken with you. This is going to be broadcast, and we will, of course, as always, give you the transcript after the session, and if there are any corrections, please make sure that you put them forward to us. If I may start by just asking you if you'd like to make any opening statements before we go into the questions that you've had prior notice of. I always warn witnesses, the committee may not stick to the questions, so please be alerted to that. But Ms. Gavas, would you like to start with an opening short statement, or should we go straight into questions?
Good morning. I'm absolutely fine to go straight into the questions.
Fine, let's go that way.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And also apologies for a rather coffee voice this morning. So if I may start, and either can start by taking it, is in your view, what do you think UK development policy will now lose when we leave the EU? Or do you think it will be enhanced? And if so, how do we continue to make the impact that the UK has been making as a member of the European Union?
Thank you. So I think there are two areas where the added value of the EU really manifests itself as a development actor. And I would say, firstly, as a multiplier of UK influence. And secondly, as a channel for UK aid. So just thinking about the multiplier effect, and there are some very concrete examples of how this actually works. So in international fora, the UK and the member states negotiate as part of a team. It's a team EU approach, which certainly carries more heft. And the UK has throughout been able to influence the negotiating position of the EU to a very positive effect. The second area is really around the networks and the cooperation agreements that the EU has, in particular with its partner countries in Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Western Balkan routes. So the UK would not be able to replicate those networks and also bring the leverage that working with the EU gives it. Now, as a channel for UK aid, the EU has offered its reach, its extensive reach, its presence in over 100 countries in the world, and its geographic reach actually extends far beyond the UK's bilateral footprint, with programs in North and West Africa, with the Eastern Partnership, again, where the UK has very limited presence. It's also offered the UK a very wide array of its financial instruments, and in particular, some of those instruments around the provision of guarantees, of blended finance, of budget support to fragile states. These are the so-called state-building contracts. As well as its grant instrument. And then finally, I would say the EU as a mechanism to pool, to coordinate, and to raise aid it has been absolutely crucial, especially in terms of influencing the policies of the other 27 member states, but also the sharing of experience, of know-how, and the coordination of aid.
Thank you, Mr. Maxwell.
It's a really good question, because the UK is a powerhouse in development, with a £15 billion budget, over 700 professional advisors in DFID spread around the world, very high-quality aid programme, recognised everywhere as the global leader in development. So you might ask, why do we need anybody? Why do we need the World Bank? Why do we need any of the regional development banks and so on? Well, there are quantitative and qualitative answers to that. The quantitative answer is that by participating, you get more. You get more money, you get more votes, You get more troops on the ground if you're doing security projects, more police missions, and so on. So that's a really important reason for us to be part of, have been part of an EU enterprise. And then there's a qualitative answer, which is the kind of thing that Mikaela was talking about. We don't know much about French West Africa. We don't know a great deal about the ring of friends around the Mediterranean. So definitely we can benefit from working with the EU there. And I just want to add one thing, which is that it's really important that you ask the question about development and not just about aid. Because one of the great features of British development policy is it brings together aid and trade and security and climate policy and migration. And if you look across all of those, we multiply our effort if we work with other people.
Thank you. Can I just very quickly follow, just a short follow-up on that? I mean, what then do we need to be doing now that we leave, to strengthen those networks, knowing that we are going to be leaving that particular institution and having to still work with those institutions? What would be the sort of key messages now that you think we should be sending out?
I think the first thing is we may be leaving the EU, but we're going to be carrying on paying into the budget for at least the next 5 years at the rate of £1.5 billion a year for the next 5 years or so. So we need to make sure that we understand that money is properly directed, spent well, and is accountable to the UK Parliament, among others. So the role of this committee and others certainly is not going to disappear on the 1st of February, I trust. In terms of where we go next, cooperation is a kind of a ladder, and on the first rung of the ladder, you just share information, you swap mobile phone numbers and hope they don't get hacked. And then as you move up the ladder, you end up doing more joint programs, more things together. And there's certainly a very strong case for swapping mobile phone numbers. There's a more difficult case as you move up the ladder, and I think we probably disagree on this question. My view is that we should be pretty careful about putting large amounts of money into EU programs which are, run by the Commission and the Council, accountable to the European Parliament, audited by the Court of Auditors, run through European regulations, and in the end, subject to the European Court of Justice. And we will not be members of any of those bodies. So cooperation, I think, is a really important point for the future.
Thank you. Gavas, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, so my own view is that I think we need to ensure that as many doors continue to be open to the UK to cooperate and to invest in the EU. And there are a number of ways of doing that at the very basic level, on information sharing through participation in joint programming exercises, but all the way to more formal types of cooperation whereby the UK could contribute financially to the instruments. Of course, there would need to be a negotiation around reciprocity as well as value for money and ensuring UK accountability. At the same time, as a third country, the UK will not have a seat at the table and therefore will not be able to be involved in strategic decision-making. However, again, there are layers below that whereby the UK could participate in working groups, in the Council, in informal structures to ensure that accountability and scrutiny.
Thank you. Lady Chalker?
Almost answered the second question in your answers to the first, but because we have been successful in influencing EU policy, there's no doubt. But how do we avoid losing the influence? You say we won't be in the decision-making process. How can we continue to make an impact? Because I believe that we still have a role to play, despite having left the community, regrettably. And I wonder how you see that playing out.
Thank you. I mean, I think the reality is that under no circumstance will we be able to have the same level of influence as we have had. And I mean, there are ways in the margins of continuing to have some level of influence, but I maintain that we will not be able to have that influence. There are other sets of informal working groups of member states, of like-minded member states. The Nordic Plus, for example, the former Utstein group, and so on. And these are fora where member states get together, share information, and think about their own strategic positioning. But we certainly will not be able to be at the table. The Commission has been absolutely clear. No matter what level of financial contribution the UK wants to channel through the EU, we cannot be treated and we cannot have the same benefits as a member state.
But, there's another question one might have asked, which is the EU could be asking itself, what do we have to do to collaborate better with the UK after Brexit? I mean, this should not be a one-sided conversation, and one would hope that there is a certain amount of nervousness in development circles in Brussels that they might be losing influence in the UK, as well as the other way around. But if we stick to UK influence and participation in EU programmes, both Mikaela and I have spent quite a bit of time fossicking around in the fine print of the various regulations. And the EU has a number of ways in which non-member states can participate in programmes, delegated cooperation, trust funds, and external assigned revenue facility, which probably Mikaela can explain better than I. But if you read the fine print, first of all, there are eligibility concerns with all those. Some of them are only open to some members, by special exception to non-member states. Some of them you can only participate, but they only apply to certain countries. You have to be a HIPIC country, for example, for there to be access to EU programmes. And all of them are subject to, as I said earlier, EU regulations and EU accountability procedures. My view has always been that we might need to buy a ticket on as cheap as possible, a seat at the back of the stalls to participate in EU programmes, because that would give us a voice. For example, we might want to participate in one of the trust funds where non-member states can have a seat at both the strategic level and the operational level, although I think without a vote in most cases. But if we want to do serious work with the EU, then the way to do it is for us to approach them as equals and to say, let's do something together about fragile states. And I hope we might come later on to climate change as another very big opportunity. And we're not going to give you money, we're not asking you to give us money, but let's actually do something together with shared objectives and shared vision, shared energy, and work side by side. And of course, what developing countries don't want is to, bull elephants. I don't know what male or female large elephants trampling around, treading on things and getting in each other's way. If you have large players in development, then what developing countries need is for them, developing countries, to be in control and for others to fall behind and for the donors to collaborate.
Could I have a follow-up there? Have you seen any efforts so far, and it's probably too early days, but by the diplomatic side of the business in making the contacts which have been development side business for a long while?
There are deep contacts outside government in think tanks, universities, NGOs, and my impression is that DFID, and I guess the Foreign Office too, have been pretty good at building networks in Europe and keeping people like us informed.
I'm not entirely sure I would agree with that. I think that ever since the UK has withdrawn from the formal structures, so no longer participating in working groups in the council, I think contact has waned. And this is only from the development side and from DFID. The discussions with the Commission have also been put on hold. So I think that DFID runs a real risk of shutting itself out of discussions in Europe, in Brussels.
Lord Oates.
Well, you mentioned the figure of 1.5 billion which the UK contributes to EU development programmes. Do you have a figure for what proportion that is of the total EU development budget?
The figure that springs to mind is of the order of 10%. Mikaela may have it.
Yeah,
it's about
right.
it's about
10 to
that.
12%.
Thank you.
Hello.
I
was. I mean, the first part of my question was sort of slightly turning. You've answered on the benefits of cooperation and why should the EU and the UK cooperate on development after Brexit, but actually slightly turning this on its head and saying, well, okay, where do the development objectives differ in practice? And, and are there actually areas where the UK could probably do a better job on its own than having to slavishly follow what the EU is laying down as their law, particularly as we will not have the accountability mechanisms afterwards that we had before. So actually it's sort of another way of looking at the question.
It's a very important point. The EU and the British government are both SDG compliant, Sustainable Development Goal compliant. They've both signed up in 2015 to the Sustainable Development Goals. The EU has put a lot of effort into producing what it calls a consensus on development, which is consistent with being SDG compliant. And by the way, the UK has played quite a big part in helping to shape that consensus against a number of countervailing forces about where money is spent and what it's spent on and how tied it is. So I think, in principle, at that high level of what do we think development is about, both the UK and the EU have a lot to share. They both agree that development isn't just about aid. They both see the problem of fragile states. They both see the issue of building a link between diplomacy, development and defence. They're both interested in global public goods as well as in national development programmes. The EU does some things and has historically done some things that we don't very much do anymore in the UK. They probably have more infrastructure spending than we do, partly through the European Investment Bank, and they also spend in places that we historically don't and might want to consider in a post-Brexit world. For example, we used to have an office and spend money in the Balkans. I think now we don't. Turkey has an enormously large share of EU funding. If we leave, we probably wouldn't have very much spending in Turkey, and it's debatable whether we should or not. And ditto around the Mediterranean. Latin America, another one. So if you compare at the level of detail what we spend our money on and where we are active, and where they spend their money on and where they are active, there is not a perfect match. And the question, I think, for British policymakers will be, is that good news or bad news if we leave? I mean, some people might think it's excellent that we don't spend 25% of our budget in Turkey. Some people might think that we need to carry on spending there for geopolitical reasons or because of humanitarian needs.
But essentially we'll be making our own decisions on that.
Well,
not really.
Of course, we already do. Well, the UKA programme, which is 15 billion or so, 60% of that at the moment is bilateral. The bilateral share will go up a little bit after we leave the EU. The multilateral share, we have a voice in the World Bank and the regional development banks and so on. And the bilateral share we decide ourselves. So we're bringing back into that decision-making matrix the 1.5 billion that we currently spend in Brussels.
Thank you.
So maybe I could just add, I agree with Simon. I think, especially on development, I think the EU and the UK can achieve much more by acting in concert. I mean, there is one area where the UK could potentially do better on its own terms, and that's in relation to trade. In particular, it could offer, for example, it could extend duty-free access to all developing countries. It could liberalize rules of origin, remove agricultural subsidies, and finally it could offer sort of cash on delivery aid for trade programs. The concern, though, is that the direction of travel on trade with developing countries at the moment it seems as though the UK will just roll over the current EU trading arrangements with developing countries and not aim for a more ambitious trading arrangement, at least in the short term. But I do believe there is potential there on the trading front.
I think Earl of Sandwich wanted to come in with a supplementary.
See, a few years ago looked at water in sub-Saharan Africa through EU programs and found that something like 50% were not functioning. And the Audit Commission was looking at that as well. I think in your previous evidence you said that the EU standards in that sort of technical area were coming up quite quickly. I think you said that there had been a move nearer to DFID standards. Have I got that right?
Well, I think that's our impression, but there's also independent verification of that through evaluation work, but also there are a number of aid quality indices, and DFID has carried out its own bilateral, multilateral aid reviews a number of times in recent years. We used to worry a lot about the quality of EU aid spending and about their inability to spend. There are plenty of things that keep me awake at night, and that isn't these days one of them. I don't know whether you agree with it.
I agree.
Okay, thanks.
Just coming back to what you were saying, Michaela, about the trade side of it. I mean, a couple of days ago, there was a very large trade conference between UK and Africa here in London, and the Prime Minister was very clear that he wanted to ensure that that there would be as much reduction in barriers to those countries. So maybe that is something that is now going to be part of the wider think from the UK towards countries where we do actually give aid, maybe linking it up better in how it's going to be spent to enable economic growth.
About Africa, but you go first.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. There is, as I said, there is the potential there. I think in the short term, however, the idea is just to continue with the existing arrangements, but hopefully we could aim for a more ambitious.
Can I comment on Africa more generally? Fascinating to see the summit, and I read the Prime Minister's speech very carefully on Monday, and I think we should be enthusiastic about the British government's commitment to Africa. The EU has a similar commitment. You know, the very first overseas trip Ursula von der Leyen made was to Addis Ababa to meet with the President and Prime Minister of Ethiopia, but also the President of the African Union. And so there's a kind of collaborative competition at play between those two. There is definite scope for increasing UK investment and economic activity in Africa. We have to be a little bit careful not to forget the lessons we've learned about private sector involvement in Africa. And it's true that the Prime Minister was right to say there are many investment opportunities. There are many other aspects to British business overseas that are worth considering. Tax should be on the agenda and how tax is managed. Business standards and ethics. Linkages between business activity and local economies, job creation, for example. Issues to do with the whole regulatory framework for business, health standards, environmental standards, green economy standards, so that the message to British business is, yes, there are opportunities in Africa. Don't expect I hope, lavish funding from the aid programme, because the aid remains untied, and mutual benefit needs to be argued for. But as we invest in Africa, let's not forget this whole range of other aspects of a socially and environmentally responsible, sustainable business endeavour.
Indeed. Lord Oates, I think you wanted to follow up.
Just on that trade point, I saw figures at the time of the trade conference suggesting that I think France and Germany have double the trade with Africa that the UK has. I'm not sure if you saw those figures. Do you have a view of why it is that those countries have been more successful in trading relationships with Africa?
No. Good question, but we don't, I'm afraid. I mean, there's always a discussion about whether tying, and I don't know the specifics of those two countries, but people do say that countries that offer tied aid and are able to deliver large infrastructure projects quickly get more business than those that don't. And that's one of the debates that underlies the commitment to mutual prosperity as a driving force of British development policy.
Lord Fraser, I think you wanted to come in.
Do you not think it's logical that we have a sphere of influence in Africa and other places? The Spaniards obviously have a big sphere of influence in South America. The French have a grip on Francophone Africa like a boa constrictor. Do you not think it's logical that this should continue? And of course the Germans have a vested interest in keeping Turkey happy. We know that. So you said that some people argue that we might do better separate from the EU, which some people think we should be better in the EU. Which side are you on that in that argument?
Well, first of all, on spheres of influence, which an economist might call comparative advantage, absolutely you're right, of course. But these places all have spillover impacts on the UK. So the migration crisis in Europe spills over to the UK and is driven by what is happening in the Sahel. So the UK has a definite interest in, if asked and in the right circumstances, helping to deal with terrorism in the Sahel, for example, and supporting the French in that way. And, we might hope the French would work with us. Somalia piracy was one of the great successes of the previous commission, and is, again, one is not necessarily our sphere of interest, but we benefit and work together. On the specific question of Turkey and middle-income countries, my view has always been that, well, it's a complicated question. My view, I've always been very surprised that the world gives so much aid to Turkey. The reason for that is because people want to help Turkey, but it's also because Turkey is still on the OECD list of aid-eligible countries. And I think attention needs to focus less on where we're giving money to, but more on where we're giving aid money to and the construction of that list. So,
and surely this is connected with Germany, because the Germans are terrified of more and more Turkish immigrants coming into it. It may or may not be good for their football team, but they think it's too much.
But also, there's a migration issue, and of course, there's now a big humanitarian caseload in Turkey, which is a slightly separate question. But the problem is who's on this DAC list, and that is not driven by political interests; it's about per capita income, mainly. But I always used to say to committees like this that every time we send £1 to Brussels, we're taking £1 away from low-income countries and giving it to, and giving ATP. We're taking money away from low-income countries and giving it to middle-income countries, and that usually has been contrary to British policy.
Davis.
Thank you. Well, first of all, on British exports, I don't think anybody should be surprised about French exports or German exports being higher anywhere, because they are higher in virtually every country in the world. I think Germans about twice our volume of exports. The impression that you've given me, both of you in your comments this morning, is that the costs to us and to our international aid effort of Brexit are certainly non-trivial, and they are quite serious. Ms. Gavas said that really however much money we've handed to the Commission or prepared to channel through the Commission's international aid effort, we wouldn't actually get any influence in terms of decision-taking and influence over strategy, and we wouldn't be given any kind of contractual rights to exercise influence of that kind. So I think that was very clear. I imagine that the losses that we incur by leaving in this way are partially loss of synergy, economic synergies, for example, logistics, very obvious one, management. Both those two things can be saved on quite substantially. We have several operations in one territory. Other services like medical services or computer services, but also political influence. If you want to influence the donee country, the recipient country, as I think you often do need to do or try to do in international development, because one wants their policies to be rational, to be supportive of economic growth and so forth, you're likely to have much more opportunity to do that if you're the European Union than if you're just one former member state of the European Union. And equally, the European Union can, like USAID or the World Bank, can always, pretty much always have a conversation and schedule a meeting, a review meeting with the recipient country, which is taken very seriously by local politicians. We probably find ourselves in a less strong position in terms of exercising that sort of influence. Is that a fair summary of what you've been trying to put over? I did notice also there was a cleavage between Mrs. Gavas and yourself, Mr. Maxwell. You were a bit more optimistic about, I think, about the continual influence you might be able to have with the EU if we embark on certain kinds of collaboration.
After you.
I think that was an absolutely accurate summary of the situation. If I could just add around spheres of influence, I mean, we shouldn't forget China and China's influence in Africa, and we're never going to be able to compete with China in terms of scale of investment, in terms of speed of investment. We stand a better chance as the EU of doing that, of projecting our own distinctive type of investment in China, which has perhaps more of a human face to it. So, with a focus on human capital. But as the UK, we stand no chance.
Well, I think you're being very frank and very realistic. And I think in life, before one plans any venture in any field, one wants to make sure that one hasn't fooled oneself, and one has taken into account all the difficulties and the challenges, as well as the wishful thinking that inevitably goes into any new project. In that context, I just want to quote you the question that's on the brief that I haven't actually asked you yet, but it fits in very naturally here, this point in our proceedings, I think. What will be the key challenges of future cooperation, and what should be the key principles and terms governing the UK's participation in EU development programmes? Well, you've already said there won't be any participation in EU development programmes. There might be some future cooperation. There might be some other contact of various kinds. Is there any positive answer that you can give to that question as to, given all the problems we've just enumerated, whether there nevertheless remains worthwhile things that might be done, and what you would think should be the right priority in putting them forward?
Can I just begin by picking up a comment on your summary, which was concise and to the point, and thank you for that. Countries differ in their need for multilateral engagement. And one of the points we often make, both Mikaela and I, about this is that ministers have objectives, and at the margin they make choices about how best to achieve those objectives. And so for a British minister, sometimes the best way to achieve an objective has been through the EU, but sometimes it's been through the UN or the World Bank or the Commonwealth or the Council of Europe or NATO, a range of other alternatives. If you're Latvia, or Cyprus, Mikaela's home country, you don't quite have the same range of choices. You're not a Security Council member and so on. So although I think it's of course, as you rightly say, damaging for the UK to lose one of its channels of influence, there are others. And what would be very helpful to see, and I hope we'll come a little bit later on to the question of what the UK's future strategy should be, would be to rethink how we deploy our resources in the multilateral world, given that we have less influence in the EU. Are we going to be as influential in the EU? If it's simply a question of sending them papers and having lunch with people in Brussels, then probably the answer is no. But we have other instruments in our locker, and a big one of those is money. So I think I've said to this committee before, my recommendation would be to make a big multi-billion pound offer to the EU on a topic like fragile states, and I would like to bring in climate change before we finish this session, and say to them, okay, look, yeah, we're going to collaborate, and we're not just going to ask you to listen to us over lunch, but we brought something substantial to the table. If you match it, let's have a serious conversation. And I think that would be transformative. And in terms of the specific of your last question on principles, Mikaela and I wrote a paper some years ago in which we talked about culture and calculus as the two driving forces of EU engagement. And a lot of Europeans start with culture. Kind of post-war, we're all together, we're one family, we believe in Europe. The UK has always been much more instrumental and calculating about its engagement with the EU. And the calculus is, what are we trying to do? What's the best way to do it? Is the EU the right format? And there's nothing wrong with being self-interested in that way in a multilateral context. So I think we're all going to be guided by the desire to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the core principle which underlies development work. We're all going to be guided by the use of different instruments, diplomacy, development, defence, and that provides the foundation for the conversation that we could be having, in which we don't just bring ideas to the table, but we also bring serious money and conceivably military engagement as well.
Well, I agree with you, we should be thinking along those lines, but they're not going to come to us, are they?
Well, if you were sitting in Brussels, why would you be interested in the UK? The DFID has 700 professional advisors. The EU has very close to zero. It doesn't have that cadre of people. We have 700 people who are specialists in governance and livelihoods and climate change and economics. So that's a big advantage for them. We have big resources in some of the countries they're very interested in.
You envisage the Commission taking on either as consultants or as staff those 700 British officials do?
No, but I can imagine them ringing the Secretary of State and saying, can we have some input? And by the way, one other strength we have is a very, very rich ecosystem of NGOs. And, we should be working hard to preserve UK NGO access to EU funding because they need us.
I think we'll move on, and if we have time, we can come back to because it's obviously a very detailed area that we need to address. Lord Fraser.
There are some key developments in the UK and the EU since you last submitted evidence to the committee. Are there any that could significantly impact the UK's future cooperation with the EU? I mean, I think we've partly covered that, but
yes, but can I lead on that?
Yes, sure.
I think this is the nub of where this committee can be phenomenally useful in the weeks ahead. Of course, on the UK side, new government and Brexit, but also some new tendencies in the EU aid programme, the big emphasis on Africa, as evidenced on Monday, the focus on business that was launched actually when Theresa May went to Cape Town, and the big one, certainly for the next year or two, is going to be climate change, because we've taken on responsibility for the COP in Glasgow, and the new DFID single departmental plan published last June has 5 objectives, one of which is climate, is environmental, and talks about the climate catastrophe. This is actually the alpha and omega of development policy for the future. We've also been promised, I think, but you may know more about this than I do, a review of foreign and development policy, and that could be the equivalent of a new white paper which would shape development policy for the future. So the UK is not where it was when you started your inquiry 18 months ago. On the other side of the channel, there's a new commission which has declared its intent to be more geopolitical. And Ursula von der Leyen, speaking in Davos yesterday, talked about the need to build the military capability of the EU, for example. They have launched a big new initiative on climate change themselves, the Green Deal, a €1 trillion package on climate change. They've committed to eventually to zero carbon by 2050, which is a very important coherence with the UK. They're working on the new multi-annual financial framework, and then they're also planning a conference on Europe, which would give the opportunity to raise the same issues. So, to conclude, this is not the same relationship, never mind Brexit, that we were talking about 18 months ago. There are big new opportunities here if we are ambitious and can go out and take them. You look a bit sceptical, Lord Fraser, are you?
Well, I'm not a climate alarmist, and I find the concentration at top of the priority of climate change as bizarre. I think that there's poverty all around the world. There's all sorts of problems with access to water, fresh water, and other matters which are incredibly important. And I think climate change somehow it sort of sweeps everything else. This is just my personal opinion, and I think it needs to be put back in its box slightly, as a matter of fact.
Just very briefly, you said there are huge opportunities here, but do you mean huge opportunities for third countries, as we are now considered to be?
The huge opportunities for a new collaboration of the kind I described earlier, where we both bring all our tools to the table. I was in India just before Christmas, for example, which is, in my view, a swing state on climate change because of its past dependence on coal. And we could be doing something very serious to partner India. And my proposal has been that all countries are not required to produce new climate plans for Glasgow, but many will, and those that don't have plans to 2030 are required to produce plans for 2030. In the last round, developing countries produced conditional plans, they're called nationally determined contributions. They produced conditional NDCs with the gap between the unconditional and the conditional depending on developed country support. So my idea has been that actually we should be encouraging developing countries to make much more ambitious conditional pledges in their NDCs, and that we as a developed community, including the EU and the UK, should be pledging to support the gap, to help them bridge the gap between conditional and unconditional.
Do you think we have a lot of influence, Mr. Maxwell, with developing countries in general and India in particular?
Do we?
Yes.
Well, we certainly work hard at that, and our climate representative was in Delhi last week, and we have quite a lot of programs still in India. And, we have many friends in India, I guess, many of us.
You're an optimist.
Ms. Gavas, would you like to come back?
Could I just add, bringing it back to Brexit, I would say that any friction on trading or economic arrangements between the UK and the EU going forward are going to contaminate future negotiations on development and foreign policy for that matter. So I think I would just want to add that too. For example, acrimonious negotiations on EU citizens' rights, again, will spill over into the development discussions.
Right, okay. I think we'll move on. Lady Chalker.
I find it difficult to envisage how the formal cooperation is going to bed down. And therefore, when I can't see a way through in the formal route, I look for informal linkages we might be able to develop in order to get the best for the very needy developing world. Can you see what formal cooperation might look like in practice? Can you put your finger on any informal routes which would help to supplement formal cooperation?
So there are a number of formal routes we could go down. So there are the instruments, the financial instruments that we could contribute to. So we could make a financial contribution to heading 6. This is sort of the neighbourhood and the developing world. And we can do that through something that Simon mentioned. It's called the External Assigned Revenue Facility. And a number of countries do that already, Norway and Switzerland. We could contribute to some of the EU trust funds. Again, as Simon said, that would give us a seat on the strategic board and oversight of the spending of the trust funds. However, the Commission does have a final veto on all decisions with the trust funds. We could contribute to, for example, the European Peace Facility, which is now being proposed to be taken off the EU budget. And this, sort of is the former Africa Peace Facility, of which the UK was a big supporter. So we could do that. DFID has just become eligible for EU guarantees as part of the European Fund for Sustainable Development investment platform. So again, we could access EU funding through that, the EU guarantees in particular. There are other ways. Simon mentioned delegated cooperation. We have quite a substantive delegated cooperation agreement program with the EU, and that could continue. And of course, joint programming at country level. So there are a number of options in a formal space. Informally, as I mentioned previously, we can continue to be part of groups of like-minded member states. The UK, unfortunately, DFID has withdrawn from the EU like-minded group of states, which I found to be a great pity. In fact, this is an informal group of countries like Germany, the Scandinavians, and so on, including Poland. Poland is part of the group as well. An interesting forum. They would meet regularly, discuss positions, and so on. DFID has now withdrawn from that group, which is a pity.
Do you think that's recoverable? Because I understand that one of the reasons that they withdrew was a clash of certain individuals, which led them to withdraw.
I do think it's recoverable. I heard from a number of member states on that group that they were genuinely surprised.
Yeah. I think that those of us who are slightly connected, like me, hear these tales all the time. Have you got any advice as to whether this committee could help to restore the former relationship, which was valuable?
Yes. Perhaps. Perhaps. I mean, I think the thing with the like-minded group is that although important for, there are quite technical sort of discussions that happened, and therefore, it didn't. The discussions didn't occur at a sort of a high level. It was sort of below Director General level, more technical. I think the more valuable groups perhaps are around the Directors General groups, the EU DGs meetings, and again, there's no reason why the UK could not participate in those meetings as an observer, even.
But I think your key point was the informal relationships need to be kept. And somehow
Absolutely.
or other we need to, whether it's through committees or
Yes.
individuals.
They actually need to be enhanced.
Yeah.
Yes,
in
exactly.
the current situation.
And sorry, just to say, we also have the possibility of continuing our secondment program as well. We could have seconded national experts in the Commission, in the External Action Service, which would be very valuable.
How are we getting that up?
If we can move on, because we're running short of time. Earl of Sandwich.
My question is about NGOs, but it's also about if everything else fails, if there's only a high-level agreement on the future relationship that does not address overseas development cooperation specifically, how will this affect the UK's ability to cooperate, and what impact will this have on UK NGOs? And I know you've just been speaking with enthusiasm about NGOs, but they're an assorted lot. The European ones and, of course, the indigenous ones should be included in that parameter.
The issue that it's a great pity has not been resolved is the extent to which quite a bit of EU aid is tied, and a lot of the issues about future partnership and also about the role of NGOs are related to that. Because if EU aid was completely untied, not just in projects overseas but in the research programs, there would be many opportunities for informal collaboration between the EU and the UK. When it comes to NGOs, there are different rules governing the development and the humanitarian side, and different geographical limitations on what can be done. The one that I think has been most worrying to the NGO community is the humanitarian side, because it has been ruled so far that, I think this is right, Mikaela, the only NGOs, you can have a partnership framework agreement with the EU, but you have to have your main headquarters based in an EU country. So there has been some moving of headquarters. There are some large NGO alliances like SAVE who are using their European headquarters as the channel, the conduit for proposals to the EU. If there's anything that can be done in a very short term to untie EU aid, that would be good. But we also need to make sure that the arrangements that the EU has in place for collaboration with third country organisations make it possible for UK NGOs to participate.
I mean, specifically on the UK NGOs, they have almost no future in their EU tie-ups at the moment. It's a very uncertain time for them. Are they not suffering continuously?
Well, I'm told that the ones we should be worrying about are the smaller ones. The larger ones are mostly part of large international alliances, Oxfam International, SAVE International and so on. So they're able to access money through other offices, but if you're a small NGO, then you don't have that luxury.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gavas, in the written evidence that you gave to the committee, you raised the possibility of the establishment of a UK-EU joint off-budget facility, I think you called it. Could you just tell us a little about how that would work in practice, what its advantages are over other third country cooperation models, and also whether you see any disadvantages?
So I think the idea behind this proposal was to overcome some of the challenges around governance and oversight, ensuring value for money spending, and ensuring mutual accountability for spending. The idea is that the UK and the EU could establish this off-budget facility built around the foundations that have governed the European Development Fund. So, essentially we're talking about joint decision-making, joint accountability, but crucially based on a contractual model. There is a mechanism that the EU that exists already to enable this to happen, similar to the facility for refugees in Turkey, the FRIT. So built around that mechanism, and so you would have, at the principal level, it's contractually based joint decision making and based around mutual interests, shared values, and so on. The mechanism is the facility, a sort of a trust fund, which would be jointly administered. So in terms of a geographic focus for this facility, I was thinking it could focus on a set number of countries which are of strategic interest to the UK, so in particular around sub-Saharan Africa, that are currently already being supported through the EU development programme. So the UK would then decide which EU programmes it would want to contribute to, in those countries, and then actually play a role in designing the programs together with the Commission, and then taking it through the whole cycle all the way down to country level, including sort of the joint programming of funds. In terms of accountability, my proposal would essentially be to have a joint parliamentary committee. So this would bring together delegates from the European Parliament's Development Committee and also from the House of Commons International Development Committee, as well as the involvement of this committee. I mean, looking at the advantages, this would give the UK direct discretion and control over development spending and over its funding through the EU. And it would also indirectly shape the EU program, certainly within those countries. So it would enable the UK to actually choose the countries that it would want to allocate its funds to. And this is especially crucial because what we're seeing now with the absence of the UK in terms of EU aid allocation is a shift towards Francophone Africa. France has taken over the sort of lead in the Council on development, and we are seeing that shift. From the EU's perspective, and the EU has, and the Commission in particular, has said time and time again that they do want to keep the UK as close as possible. This would enable it to do that. It would increase its firepower, and it would do so without compromising the existing structures and the existing mechanisms. So that for the advantages. I mean, for the disadvantages, it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to be very resource intensive. We're talking about people, money, sustained engagement, dialogue, both at the political and the technical levels. And the fact that this facility would be binding and contractual in nature might restrict the UK in potentially, if the UK deemed spending to be poor value for money, nevertheless it would be bound to continue to contribute. Of course, there are ways around that with written clauses which could allow the UK to withdraw funding at any point.
Thank you. We're on our final question in our last few minutes. Lord Wood.
I wanted to ask you about your view of how governments talk to NGOs and you all about the transition ahead. Is your sense that there's been good stakeholder engagement, wide consultation? We've heard in other parts of the Brexit preparation world that some businesses feel they've just been told to get ready without so much guidance. Do you feel that there's been better stakeholder engagement in the last few months?
My view is that DFID has been great. Actually, they've come to us to do workshops. They've been available on the phone. They've shared documents at the right time. That's very much focused on aid. Whether the government's been quite as good on some of the other aspects. They've been pretty good on trade. We've had good links with the Foreign Office, I think. Migration, there's certainly been conversations. I'm not so sure about security or research, but certainly I can give high praise to DFID for what they've done.
I concur with that. They've been put in a very difficult position as well. Sort of development is not a priority, it certainly hasn't been in the negotiations. They have been forthcoming in the information that they do have. And they've been, scenario planning consistently throughout. I would agree.
Thank you, and that's neatly summed up our session this morning. Once again, thank you so very much for coming in, taking time out of your incredibly busy diaries, particularly at this time of the year. And we, I think, have had a lot of food for thought from your session this morning. And I'm sure that there'll be more questions after you leave than we have managed to get onto the question paper today. But thank you so very much for coming in. I do hope to have another session with you in coming months to see where we are. As I said earlier, if there are any corrections to be made on the transcript, please let us know. Thank you so very much, Mr. Maxwell and Ms. Gavas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended.